I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Are we set? Okay, folks, tonight is a presentation for the first three sections of the capital improvement program. As you can see, council members that have been with us several years, it's a new format. It's a format that pretty much follows what we did with the operational budget. It's our initial proposal is to try to provide greater transparency to the public as to the differences between an operational budget and the differences with a capital improvement program. It's important to note from the onset that a capital improvement program is a planning financial document. It means that the numbers there, you should be looking at the flow of the numbers rather than the specific numbers, because as you go out 4, 5, 6 years, those numbers are going to change. Numbers that change are going to be, if we at this point have estimated bonds at 4% and we end up with going rates at the 2.8 or 3%, we'll see differences on a yearly basis for the update. The key with a capital improvement program is a yearly review of not only the projects, but the financial framework in which the community is operating. Certainly, if there's recession conditions, we have to look at changes in the way we put forward projects. In good economic times, we may accelerate projects or decelerate during difficult times. So let's get started with page 1-2. 1-2 looks at providing the public with definitions as to what's a capital project, what's a capital improvement program, why do we have it? I think the most important point that I want to reference on this page is why do we have it? The reason that we have a capital improvement program is really threefold. One is we want to go to all of the departments as well as the community in general, whether it's through its comprehensive plan or whether it's through council goals and objectives or department initiatives, to determine what's the need statement over the next 6-year period for different projects. And then also to look at providing some type of a prioritization of how we would implement meeting those community needs. And third, more importantly, would be to look at the community's ability to manage and finance the costs associated with the implementation plan. Again, in some years we may accelerate, in some years we may slow down. We may add new projects, or projects may drop off if they lose the priority according to what the council adopts. I think it's also important to note that based on the town charter and the capital improvement program ordinance, this is the council's document. The manager prepares it. However, it's up to the council to make the revisions that they feel are appropriate within it. Once those changes would be made, we would then look at would it require major restructuring. But this should be a planning document that the council takes ownership of in terms of it meeting what their needs will be as we move forward. What are capital projects? Anything over $10,000 in useful life and greater length in use than the years that we finance it. So we're not going to be looking at having pavement and putting out a 25 or a 30-year bond because the improvement's not going to last that long. We may look at drainage improvements as being something that would be bonded because we're looking at those improvements in infrastructure being something that would last long term. Obviously, new building construction. The rec center is under construction. It was a component and element in the capital improvement program for many years. It took on many dimensions, both in terms of cost, in terms of size, and in terms of location. So all of those different things come into place on a yearly evaluation of what programs we're looking at. If we move on, we talk about the types of facilities. I think I've mentioned most: roadways, equipment acquisition. This is on 1-2. Also our utilities. The thing that's important to note too is we want to also look within the capital improvement program at where are the funding sources for. So when we look at funding sources, property tax certainly comes in as a major contributor. But we may also be using fair share fees. We may be using assets that are held in capital reserve funds, bonds. One of the things too that we have to look at is because we have multiple funds, our utilities do not take property taxes. Our utilities, any of the improvements that are done for those utilities, whether it's the water or sewer system or solid waste, will come from the rate base itself, because those are separated from property taxes. When we look at the neighborhood guild, the bonding that we do there would come through trust funds, not through property taxes. So when we look at the combination of all those different projects that are ongoing, we look at it, it's a $27 million program, yet only a portion of that is going to be directly associated to what impact it will have on property taxation. But conversely, it also has direct impact on the assets of these various utility funds or special revenue funds. Moving on section 1-3, I just want to make sure that everyone's aware of the schedule that we're employing. We started out with the budget being submitted to the council on December 1st. We're hopeful that council and the school committee by January 15th will have had the opportunities for review, and under the ordinance, the council needs to adopt the budget by February 1st. On page 1-3, we've got the dates. We're here tonight. Tomorrow night we'll be here. Tomorrow night we'll be with the department directors, each of them being able to assist and provide information on the projects associated with their department that are resident to the budget program. And then on the 11th, next week, Wednesday, we'll be looking at meeting with the school department in terms of the proposals that they have put forward for the next 6 years. Certainly I'll have some comments on those projects, both at that meeting, but also to provide some foundation for council's reviews as we go forward. The next section I want to deal with is on page 1-6. And 1-6, and again, if anybody has questions on any of the things that they've read here, please stop me as we go along. I'm going to try to stay. One of the problems we've had in the past with the capital budget as well as operating budget is jumping back and forth. What we've tried to do here is to have it so that it's one clear path. And so if there are questions, get them to us at this point so we can try to make sure that everybody's got the information that they need. When we look at the statistical profile for the community, a couple of things that we always look at is the fact that we've got about 431 acres that's in recreation space that is used within the community, and 150 miles of roads and infrastructure. We are 56.8 square miles of land and 62 square miles when we look at, for the most part, dealing with Warden's Pond and the Great Swamps.
What page are you on, Steve?
I'm sorry?
Oh, you're going off.
I'm on page 1-6. You can do it either way. You can go with the PowerPoint, but I'll reference the page if people are using the book. I think on page 1-6, and I mentioned this last meeting that we had, is the U.S. Census data is important for the council to take a look at and to understand, because the census data, when we look at 1990 and we look at the number of people within the community below the age of 14, we see that 16% were under 14. It went up to 18%, 18.6% by the year 2000, and it has plummeted 25% down to 12.7%. What we're also seeing is that in the ages over 60, we went from a population share of 15% over age 60 and 90, stayed relatively the same at 14.8 in 2000, but in the 14 years that went forward for the American Community Survey for 2014, we're now up 68%, or a 22.8% population share. As we continue to see declining birth rates and slowdowns in any type of residential development within the community, or residential development of plus 55 developments, we're going to continue to see that number of age 60 going up, and we're going to continue to see a decline in the school-age children. You'll also see there's an anomaly with the 15 to 24, and the 15 to 24 in the year 2000, it dropped to 23% of the population, and then jumped back up to 28. That's because of URI. In 2000, it was a time when we had a couple of dorms closed and new dorms under construction. So that's an anomaly there. They will make up that population share from the 15 to 24 is probably in the in that range of 28% to 30% of our population. Will continue to see that. We certainly, and you can see that when you look at the non-institutionalized and institutionalized population. You can see that we went from 5,000 people in non-institutionalized group quarters, and so we changed from 5,000, lost 1,200, and then went back up because we opened new dorms. So they're going to have some influence on the population, but still, even with the influence that increase in dorm enrollment has, we're still seeing a major change toward the older population within the community. What does that mean to us? It means that we're going to see additional needs in those services that are directly related towards seniors, whether it's senior program, whether it's EMS services, whether it's those type of programs. We may also see it in terms of additional social programming that's necessary that would be targeted, let's say through the Guild, for those types of programs that would be of interest to persons in a plus 60 age. That may also, as we go forward, start to place new demands within the capital program for development of infrastructure, whether it's additional walking paths, whether it's bike paths, those types of things that would be shared not just by the young, but also by the old. And we'll see that as we go forward over the next few years. Jumping on, the next chart just shows the population growth, as you can see from 1960 up through where we are today. It's interesting that the census population is showing a decline of about 150 people in the last 4 years. I'm not sure whether that's just because it's a global estimate that's being made from what it had been in 2010, but the American Community Survey that comes out through the Census Bureau has estimated that we've stabilized and we're not continuing to see what used to be about a 1% per year increase in population. Moving on page 1-7, we look at the pricing of medium-priced homes. And you can see when we go back before the recession, the average home value was up at about $370,000. We've reclaimed a good portion of that value, but we're still at about $332,000. We still have at this point about 13,134 units in the community, and it's about an 80-20 split as far as seasonal to year-round. And when we look at the year-round, we're looking at about 75% being owner-occupied. We've seen the average size of the family go from about 2.65 down to 2.5 over the last 10 years. So again, we're also seeing a moderate decline in the size of the family, which then would have some impact as far as our school systems are concerned. When we look at housing, On page 1-8, we see that the values are still, taking a 9-year period here, $39,000 below what that median price had been. When we look at the assessment values, it's about a $68,000 decline in what the assessment ratios were. You can also see that from 2008 through 17, we've seen the average household increase about $617, or about an average of 1.25% on a yearly basis. So we've stayed well below the cap of the 4%, yet at the same time, we've seen increases in the property tax levy needs to be able to support the programs within the community. The next chart on 1-8 looks at the tax levy. And again, as far as the 5-year period that we're looking at, if you look at this, you're looking at an average of about 1.33% over the 5 years. The municipal side has picked up about over 12% of that increase, and the school's about 4%. So the net is about 6% overall. But the increase that we're looking at on a compound basis is 1.33. On a flat rate basis, the increase would be about 1.5. So still well below the 2% targets that we've used when we start budget development on a yearly basis. The next page is an important note because it shows the difference with the revaluation that occurred between this year and last year. As you can see, for the 16-17 year, we're looking at the flexible tax base, which is the real estate intangible, showing an increase of about 5.7%. That's about $238 million increase. So you've got a base of $4.4 billion in taxable property. One of the things I'd point out is when you look at the value of motor vehicles, because of the revaluation changes that occurred, we're seeing that the motor vehicle value is down a little bit from what it had been in the prior year. Motor vehicle values are about 4.3% of the roll. But again, when people say, well, where does money come from that pays for the town to operate? Most of it is your residential, almost 84 cents on the dollar. We're seeing really the stabilization within the commercial tax base itself, even with the revaluation, and we're seeing the industrial and the utilities staying relatively constant. So there isn't a lot of change on a proportionate basis. That's why we saw a substantive change in the tax rate from a $15.52 rate down to a $15.09 rate, even though we were up about 2.7% in terms of new tax dollars. But I think that it's important for us to look at where the money comes from, because a lot of that depends on where the money should be going. The next chart looks at unemployment, and you can see that back in 2007 we had about a 4.4% unemployment rate, and we're now down to about 3.8%. So we've finally gotten away from those recession years. I do want to caution, unemployment rates are not a really good indicator of what the employment opportunities are in a community. And I say that because there are many people that may be considered employed that are underemployed or working multiple jobs. So while, yeah, we're moving in the right direction as far as the 3.8%, which is as of November of 2016, and yes, it's 1.6 below what it had been an average in the calendar 2015, it still means that there are people that are readily employable that are unemployed. The workforce in South Kingstown right now is about 16,500 people, of which 620 are gainfully looking for employment. There's 15,900 that are employed. The last time we saw numbers similar to this would take us back almost to 2008, 2007, as far as what we saw in the 10, 11, and 12 year is a substantially smaller employment base within the community. So we're making we're making inroads, but I don't consider the 3.8, even though it's below what the state average is, as being something that says, gee, we're all set, everybody's happy, and everybody's making money. It's just not that way. When we look at the next chart, I think is a great chart to be able to look at how unemployment has become less of a driving force within the labor force itself. The next chart on page 1-10 looks at South Kingstown in relation to its other communities. We talked about this back in December when we met with the school committee. And I think that the most important thing here, and I think Abel had pointed it out admirably that night, is the fact that tax rates aren't the issue, it's what the tax levy amounts are. And what we can see here is that a town like North Kingstown may have a smaller assessment value, but when we look at some place like Narragansett's tax roll is larger than South Kingstown. Well, why would that be? Their average house, instead of being average household at $350, is probably up over $400,000. If that's the case, then it's going to have impact on what the rate is, but it's not going to change the amount of tax dollars that are going to be raised. When you look, Narragansett was the only community that had a split rate where they were charging less for the residential component and more for commercial and tangibles. That's going to change this year, so they're going to go to a unified rate. What that'll be in the 17-18 year, I'm not sure. It will provide relief to the commercial base within that community, but obviously every dollar that is provided in relief comes back as far as additional dollars that will be on the residential element itself. Narragansett is going to look at a homestead, which several communities in Rhode Island have looked at, but that homesteading also gets into a lot of issues as far as owner occupancy, length of ownership, and whether or not persons that own property and lease them out should be paying a disproportionate amount of money. We've never looked at that in South Kingstown. We've always looked at it at a straight rate for the entire tax base. It's not something that council has requested additional information on. But again, when you look at a Charleston and a Narragansett, their residential is over 90% of that roll. So when you start looking at saying that you're going to reduce rates on commercial and tangible, it's less than 4% of the total that they're dealing with on a large tax base. The next sheet also is on a carryover from page 1-10, and it looks at what the tax levy is. And you can see again that the tax levy in Westerly, for instance, who's got a population that's 10,000 people smaller than South Kingstown, has got a tax levy that's greater than South Kingstown. Well, why is that? Some communities are very heavily laden with debt, and so their debt service costs, instead of being in the 1 to 2% range like South Kingstown's is, may be in the 5 to 8 to 9% range. So again, it's a community decision that should be made based on the best information available through financial planning, which hopefully we're providing that foundation for you here. You can also see that South Kingstown is the only community within the region that has the AA1 rating. I will say that that when we showed the levy for per capita here, we showed it for the 15-16 year. Earlier this week, I got the results from the state for the 16-17 year, and we did not fare as well. We were up 2.76%, where North Kingstown was up 1.64%, Westerly was up 2.49%, Charleston was up 1.6%, and Narragansett at 2.02%. So, yeah, we had a tough year where we went up on an average of $59, where surrounding communities were in the $50 or about $10 per residential unit less. But then again, in the several years prior to that, we had been a leader in terms of minimal increases. So a lot of it depends on what is loaded into a budget in any given year, as well as what the impacts are of other agencies that are providing funding for you, whether it's the state through the Department of Education, or whether it's through state aid that comes in for city and town supports. But we still are in an enviable position in terms of the amount of debt that we have per capita. As you can see, the debt per capita is substantially less, where we're at 1.4. You got Westerly up at over 10%. That's where a lot of that tax levy is going to go to pay to service debt. 4.25 in North Kingstown and so on. We're close with Charleston, but again, that's a much smaller community, where Narragansett's debt is up at over 3%. And in fact, Narragansett in November is issuing or authorizing additional bond sales for a couple of projects. So that's not going to probably go down in the future. Our objective has always been to try to remain below a 2% in that general area. Once we get done, the last major bonding that we did would have been with the Broad Rock School. This year, probably in March of 2017, we'll be looking at the bond sales that will be necessary for the rec center and the first $1 million in school improvements. So that $5,140,000 will be going out probably in March or thereabouts. Trish will be working on putting that bond prospectus together once we get the budget document out to the council in March. Moving on, the 5-year change on the statistical profile. This looks at this really looks at what's on page 1-11, but what it does is it consolidates that report into looking just at the 11-12 year versus the 16-17 year. And what you can see is that the major driver as far as revenue increases has been directly related to property taxation, where we're averaging over $900,000 a year between municipal and school purpose to be able to account for a balanced budget. You can also see where the major changes are occurring. We're seeing reductions in state aid. We're seeing reductions in some of the local revenues. Some of this is a difficult comparison, and probably one I won't make next year, because with the transitions that we've done with the budget to move debt service out, some of the revenues that would have been resident to the 11-12 year won't be in 16-17, but at least you can see where the dollars were in 11-12. The other thing too is when we move the school department back into our general fund, there's some changes that do occur. That's why it's important to look rather at the expenditure programs themselves. The second half of this chart shows what the municipal budget program was, and you can see where the municipal program has gone up about 1.7%, or about $350,000 a year. When we look at the school transfer, this is just the amount of money that you appropriate and becomes a component of the school budget. So that $48.2 million was provided to the school to support their operating program in the 11-12 year. We're now supporting it with $51,387. Just to give a little bit more perspective on that, in the 11-12 school year, there were 3,458 students. If you divide that 3,458 students into $48,216,000, you have an average property tax per student of $13,943. When you look at the 16-17 year, you're transferring 51.38 million, and you've got 3,096 students, their count, and that divides out into $16,598 a student. So essentially, you've had about a 362 student loss over that 5-year period, or 10.5%. yet you've seen a $2,655 increase in the cost per student, or 19%. So why is that happening? Most of it's happening because of the loss in state aid that's occurring to the school programs. And the fact that just because you drop several students doesn't necessarily mean that you're saving dollar for dollar, because instead of having a class of 22 students, you may be having a class of 16 students. So your expense associated with educating that classroom that may have had 22 now has 16. That's why you're seeing that type of an exponential increase in the cost per unit, even though you're not seeing as broad of a decrease in the number of students itself. So again, there's a balance that you have to look at here. You have to look at why are these numbers moving in the direction that they are, and if they are moving in that direction, what's the prognosis for the future? When we look at a NESDIC report, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later, which has for the last 20 years, I believe, been estimating student population growth and decline, what we're seeing is a predictive up through the year 2026 of additional student loss, where the question will then have to be addressed is how do you maintain the number of school buildings that you're occupying without looking at what the enrollment on a per class basis will be, and how would you maintain those buildings if in fact you don't need to maintain all of those buildings. So this is what I'm trying to provide to you, is to have a better understanding of not what the answer is, but rather how to get to a reasonable conclusion as to where you want to take your budgets, whether it's capital or it's operational in nature. Page 11 provides a breakdown again of the second part of that page, where we look at the school revenues, and here it becomes a little bit more evident is that you're at 82.5% in 11-12, where you're up at almost 86% at this point in terms of property tax transfer that's necessary. You also see where you had 15% coming from the state, and now you've got only 12. That's because of the education aid formula that has a 10-year step down of about $340,000 a year. In addition to the $340,000 step down per year over that 10-year period, or is it 8? Is it 8 or 10? 8-year period. What we're also seeing is that because the education dollars are being distributed on a per pupil basis, for every 100 students that you lose, you're losing the residual value that was coming for that student. So you've got a step down loss, and you've got a unit cost loss for the loss in the enrollment market. When you look at the combined, when we look at what the total property tax, state aid, and local revenues are, which is really your general fund per se, you're looking at property taxes going from 78.5 up to 80, almost 82%. If we continue to see the losses in terms of the state aid, both on the municipal and the school side, there really aren't too many other sources of revenue other than the local revenues, and they've pretty much stabilized. So we're not going to see major changes there, but to be able to meet cost of living requirements, there's going to be greater pressure brought as far as tax dollars are concerned. The last part of page 11 is on the next chart, which is which looks at the tax base itself again. And I wanted to bring this up so that you see what the value of motor vehicles are. You've got a motor vehicle value that's $198 million worth of taxable property, up from 169. You can see where it's at 4.3% of the roll over what it was in 11-12 year. What changes happened at the General Assembly this year in terms of reductions in taxability on motor vehicles could have impacts on the community. If they gave us each dollar that we would lose then we would be held harmless. However, because our tax rate is $18.71 for motor vehicles, and some communities' rates are as high as $80, if they gave the monies back, there's a $200 million tax levy out there for motor vehicles statewide. That's how much tax comes in to the 39 communities. I think it's $204 million. With what we collect in motor vehicles, we got about 2.3% of that total base. So when you look at, gee, we're going to solve this over a 5-year period, it means the state would have to come up with $40 million. There's been no plan that's been documented that shows that $40 million would replace $40 million within the 39 communities. Rather, there's $40 million that will reduce the tax levy statewide. So we've got to be careful, and we've got to make sure that our legislators are aware and have a good understanding of what the implications are of various tax plans that are being floated at this point. Obviously, urban area that has high tax rates would like to see the tax forgiven on a per $1,000 basis, because for every $1,000 forgiven, if it's at an $80 rate, they get $80 back, where we would be getting $18 back. So is that a fair presentation? So we have to be aware of that, and we have to take a look at that, because there could be some profound implications to the tax structure based on what steps are taken at the General Assembly level and what type of a step plan is used for that 5-year that the Speaker is talking about at this time. Still staying on page 11, we look at the tax share, and you can see that the municipal tax share continues to increase, and we've gone from 22.4 up to 24.7. So we're seeing on the municipal side more dollars coming into us than what we are seeing as far as the school share. But obviously the school share should be minimized based on the reductions in the enrollments that are occurring, but that has to be buffered by the loss of the state aid as well. But overall, when we look at the change in that 5-year period, we're seeing an overall 1.28, probably 1.3% increase in the overall levy. But what we're also seeing is we've reduced the size of the overlay because we continue to collect more tax dollars in the year in which they're levied than what we used to. Our taxing practices and collection practices are providing us opportunities to be able to reduce overlay requirements. But we're also having to share that as far as a major portion of anything that's shared in overlay goes to the value of the school department, since 75% of all tax dollars are going to the schools. Next item on 112. I think this is an important chart because this is one that the state puts out through the Department of Labor and Training, and it looks at where are the jobs in South Kingstown between 2006 and 2014 and the number of jobs that are counted. And you can see that while government's picked up about 100 jobs, what we're also seeing is that the health and social assistance, and again this would deal directly with some of the numbers we talked about with the over 60 population, is that we're seeing an expansion within the healthcare and general services, social service programming, where we've seen the largest increase in jobs. When you go from 6 to 2014, an increase of about 500 jobs in that area. You can also see where the losses have been. Manufacturing jobs that were less than 1,000 at 956 have plummeted down to 579. So as we get more into the blue collar and the construction industry is also seeing about 100 job loss over that 8-year period. So you're seeing how the employment market is moving, as well as what your tax efforts are, as well as what your unemployment. All of these things need to be considered when you make financial planning decisions. While you're going to change them on a yearly basis, potentially, based on what you see, This is, provides you with the, with the focus for what you're looking at for the 17-18 year. When we get into the budget message, and I'm going to run through the message quite quickly, because tomorrow night what we're going to do is to go over each of the programs individually. But when we look at the program, and this is on page 2.2, we're looking at a $24 million program for capital programming, going down to $20.4 million. Obviously, the reason for that is in leisure services, where we're not showing the $6.6 million that we were showing last year for the rec center, because that's under construction. It will transition in the 17-18 year from a capital project into an operating program. Also, so you've got $4.1 million in bonds that were in the 16-17 year that disappeared. The only bonds that were showing in 17-18 leisure service associated would be the bonds associated with the Guild, which would be probably in 2019 $1 million for improvements there. That we're going to have to take a serious look at to see whether or not the Guild will continue through its trust funds to be able to generate sufficient revenue to pay down that $1 million. $1 million in bonds at 20 years at 4% start out at $90,000 in debt service in the first year, down to 88, down to 86, and so forth. The question will be to be able to provide proper supports for the Guild at around $380,000 a year. Will we be able to continue with reinvested income to have sufficient dollars to be able to meet that debt service cost? It may be something that needs to be phased. We have $1 million in authorization. That doesn't necessarily mean that we would have to spend the entire $1 million at one time. So it's something that will come more in focus when we get closer to 2019. Could they spend the entire $1 million at one time? Absolutely, in terms of transitioning that building and getting it up to a 21st century standard. The last time we had a bond for the recreation department was 22 years ago. In fact, I think current year is the last year of debt service on the existing Guild bond. We're also looking with the school department. We had $5 million in 16-17 that were bonds that were considered. We're down to $4 million in 17-18. It's not that we're reducing their program potential. What it is that we're bonding $1 million in schools in the 17 year. So we're not looking at reducing what the amounts of money would be for bonding purposes. The bonding authorization dollars, again, are authorization. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to spend the money. You have to authorize spending the money, and you're not going to authorize spending the money unless it's gone through a needs assessment and been approved by the state and will be entitled to a 35% reimbursement. So there's a lot of steps that are going to be necessary. This, as a planning document, only tells you here's what they're telling you that they need, and if they got what they say they need, then we can look at what the debt service implications would be to your overall budget. Why don't we move on? When we look at the annual funding element, one thing in the capital improvement program is that what we do is we run a capital improvement program, and the first year of the capital improvement program on the pay-as-you-go is the capital budget. That's what will be resident to your 2017-18 budget. If you approve $1,519,000, that's what we'll have to have as a budget line item within the general fund. As I said to you on December 20th, I think that amount will need to be reduced based on the size of the demands that we're seeing for operational budget support. We're going to have to take a look at that and have some recommendations for you before the council does its adoption, which we're looking at January 23rd. I think it's also important, I want this chart to point out that general fund, senior services fund, and school fund are influenced tax dollars. The enterprise funds do not. Those are rate bases I mentioned earlier. So while wastewater may be $32,000 less and water fund up $4,000, it's not material to what the impact will be on the property tax base, because all of that's coming from the rate base within those two systems. And so you'll be dealing with those capital budget items within each of the enterprise funds. Moving on to 2-4. 2-4 gives you a thumbnail of the capital improvement projects. I believe there's 18 projects, 17 projects that are listed. One's listed under, recreational leisure services. And you can see here on the chart that's on the board at this point, we're looking at a reduction in size, but obviously it's because of the change within by moving the rec center out of this program into an operational format. We are seeing a couple of changes there as far as the guild renovations. That's because during the current year, renovations are being done for about $130,000. One of the things that we're still yet to do with the guild is we need to deal with the replacement of the accessibility ramp or lift. And that lift we hope to fund out of reinvested income, but to get that work done is going to take a good portion, probably about $170,000 of what's available in fund balance within the reinvested income account for the guild. That's why I say I want to take a second look before 2019 on whether bonding is a viable option without some type of property tax support, which has never occurred with the operation of the guild since it was turned over to us in 1934. Moving on, the next grouping of projects is under the public works or public municipal programs, where we're dealing with information technology, libraries, police, public services. This is also where we've got a new line item here for affordable housing, and I'm going to talk about that in a couple of minutes, but the recommendation is that the council put forward $100,000 out of the Open Space Reserve Fund to be made available for us to begin some preliminary studies as far as what does affordable housing mean to South Kingstown and what's the objective that we're trying to accomplish, but we'll talk about that in a minute. The last page, looking at 2-4 on the charts here, shows the improvements for the school department and the water meter replacement program. I will say water meter replacement program won't have impact on the rate base. It'll come out of reinvested income. That money is available for that purpose, and that project will be done probably in the 2020 year period, depending on when we start to see erosion on the effectiveness of the existing meter system. As far as the school improvements are concerned, I'm going to talk about that in some detail. The program that they've asked for, going from 5.2 up to 7.9, would require them to go back with another needs assessment. So we have not provided bonding that they would need for that entire project, because until we see A, what buildings they're using, and B, what projects have been approved by the state, and C, what are the costs of the projects that have already been approved by the state and are allegedly to be completed before 2020, we're going to need to have a much better understanding of how those dollars are going to flow and for what purpose. So when we get to the bottom line is that we're at about a 32.8, and we're down to about $27.2 million in overall programs. When we look at the annual funding program, that's $16.7 million, $9.8 million of that money that's shown there, of the 16.7, is going back into the bonding projects. So council's aware we work with multiple capital reserve funds for public services, for the police department, for the town hall. So what we do is we appropriate money through the capital budget, transfer that money into the capital reserve, and then when we have sufficient dollars to do major projects, we do it on a pay-as-you-go basis. So while we're showing $16.7 million, 9.8 million of that 16.7 million is being transferred into the projects that are defined here as bonded projects. So essentially, while it may look like it's $37 million, it's really a $27 million when we net out what those expenses are that are capital budget, pay-as-you-go component of the capital program. The next section that I want to address starts on page 2.5, and it's issues of concern. This is a new section within my budget message on things that I'm looking for the council to develop policy directives on and to take actions if necessary. And the first is much of the discussion that we had at the December meeting on the initial budget hearing with the school department. With the declining enrollments that we're seeing, we've had a 29% loss in students since the 2001-2002 year. And we're forecasting, based on NESDEC's numbers, another 326 students to be lost over the next 5 years. So essentially, we'll be seeing about a 36.5% reduction in student enrollment since 2001-2002, yet we haven't changed any of the physical plant in which we operate within. The 6-year program that's been submitted by the school department that I've developed several questions for, look for a 6-year plan that continues to use the entire plant, number of buildings that are used for educational purposes. Were we to fund the projects based on the estimates that have been provided by the school department, and again, there's no engineering or architectural design work that's been completed to provide probable costs, we're looking at about a $7.9 million expenditure for what they've indicated. That would mean that we'd have about $4.2 million coming out of bonds. The reason I'm saying 4.2 is because we've already got $1 million in the current year, of which we're using 800,000 before June 30th of 2017. Then we're looking at an open item of $1.7 million in additional funding that could come either with program reductions or the need to get voter authorization for additional bonding. That bonding wouldn't occur probably until the 22-23 year, if in fact it were ever authorized. But I think that the plan that they have put forward is much more aggressive than would actually be completed. Remember that with school buildings, that work can really only be done during the summer months or during the times that schools are closed if there's major physical improvements that have to be made in those buildings, particularly at the elementary level. So I think that while the projects, if all of them are appropriate and justified and with proper dollar amounts on it, I don't think they would be accomplished in that time schedule that's been presented. We're also looking at the school department wanting to commit about $1.6 million over the next 6 years to parking lot improvements. And again, my concern is, are we going to be improving parking lots on buildings that will not continue to be used for an educational purpose going forward? The example I used the other night was that we were looking at a $450,000 proposal to reconfigure the parking areas with drainage improvements, obviously, that would be necessary at Curtis Corner. So that's one of those projects that we need to have more serious discussion with the school on as to where we're going. My recommendation that's here is that there needs to be really a long-term study that's done at this point that looks at, before we get to doing a necessity of school construction, that we actually do a long-term fiscal planning analysis and staffing plan. That should be done to take a look at where we've been, where we currently are, where we're projecting that we're going to go with enrollment, and what does that mean to the education program? Because it's not just about buildings, it's about how we're going to educate children. If we wanted to keep all the elementary schools just as they currently are, and we continue to lose enrollment in those elementary schools, where we have contractually the ability to have 22 students in a classroom, and right now we're averaging around 17 to 18. If we lose additional students, are we going to get down to 15 or 14 if we have all of those buildings open? That's not a question that I can answer for you, but it's a question I think that needs to be analyzed as to the what-ifs, if in fact we continue to see those enrollment declines. NESDIC estimates are on a per-class basis, and what they use is a survival cohort as they look forward as to how many kids are going to be in each of those classes going forward. That's one part of the study. Then there's the staffing that needs to be done in terms of the different programs that are being offered. It isn't a question of whether or not there's going to be less children in the elementary schools. It's a question on what the cost per classroom to educate will be if those enrollment numbers come down, and is there an ability to pay? So we're dealing both with a capital facilities conundrum as well as the issue of what's the impact on education, because certainly it's not just the buildings. We've got to make sure that the children are getting the best education that they can, but is the efficiency there to ensure that the most money is being spent on the children rather than within the facilities, or by having classroom enrollment smaller than what is necessary for efficiency. I don't know what those levels of efficiency are. I don't know what the educational requirements are from the state that are necessary, but that's why I think that if there was a long-term facilities planning, staffing, and efficiency review completed in advance of what the school department was proposing, which was to have another necessity of school construction application prepared in the spring of 2017, I think we're putting the cart before the horse. So I bring this to you as an area of concern. I think it's something that needs to be discussed with the school department and school committee when you meet on your capital budget with them next week.
The assessment that was done in 2010, is that the same one that they want to do again this spring, or is it a different study?
This, the study that, there was a study that was done in 2010. That was the last time they did the study. That was at the time when they were looking at should Wakefield School be closed, and there was a great deal of discussion as far as that issue was concerned. Since that time and the recommendations that were made were not implemented from that staffing report, I think it's important now to say, well, if we've gone since 2010 and we've got really 6 more years where there's been continued erosion of student membership, what's the implication for the next 5 years? And again, if we're going to start a new wave of facility improvements, are we doing the facility improvements in the right buildings? Because there may be greater efficiencies that can be had by retrofitting existing space. Particularly, let's deal, as a for instance with the high school. If in fact plans for the high school are spread out over a 6-year period and could be reprioritized to be in the initial years, and then provide, let's say, greater efficiency for STEM programming and those types of things, would that be a more efficient way of going forward than the existing plan that's been put forward? And again, I don't have the answers on it, but what I'm saying is that until somebody can take a look at all of those different moving parts and say, where are we going to be 5 years or 10 years from now, we need to look at it. Is it a case that you're inviting Narragansett elementary schools to be a part of the South Kingstown school system? I don't know. All I'm saying to you is that I'm suggesting there's a necessity for the public discussions on that and for some decisions to be made on where do we go. Because from my perspective, when I look at the facilities, facility needs, and the enrollment declines and the classroom ratios, I've got concerns that we're not spending the money properly.
What is the study that's being done this spring? What do we expect the result of that to be? Is it a facilities assessment, or is it the same study that was done in 2010, just done again? Like what?
It's going to look at the educational program capacity, the physical conditions of the buildings. It's going to look at ages of buildings, those types of things. One of the things I suggested at the last meeting was that they look to what the city of Warwick had accomplished, because these type of studies usually take 3 to 4 years for implementation, because there may be a necessity to look at bonding requirements as well as construction phasing, those types of things. But until somebody looks at and gets all of those different components into one report and how they mix with one another, I'm not sure you can. If we don't do that, we're going to continue to go along as we have since 2010. Even in 2010, where I think the suggestion was made that changes should be considered. The next item I wanted to mention is the fair share fees for school purposes. Well, a couple of more charts. One is this is the roll chart that I gave you at the last meeting. I showed you. I wanted you to have a copy of it, which shows where we've been since 1987 in terms of enrollments, and breaking that out by high school, 7th and 8th grade, and 5th and 6th grade in elementary, to where we are in 2016-17. So you can see that it's a gradual slope, but that slope isn't turning. And based on the demographics that we're seeing with census information, we're not assuming that we're going to see that type of change. So if that's the case, then the next slide looks at, well, what is NESDIC saying that you've got for enrollment coming up over the next 5 years? And again, what we're looking at is the loss of another 326 students. Not my estimate, but the professional's estimate, or about 65 students per year. And that's on top of the 757 students, or 76 average student loss that occurred since 2007, 2008. So again, if you're seeing those types of numbers, it's indicative of the need for an evaluation of where do we go from here. CIP issues of concern. The second one is on the school-related fair share development fees. Again, because of the declining enrollments, there's not a need for new school buildings to be constructed to service new student population that's moving into new houses. So if that's the case, we have to look at why did we set up the impact fee for education? One of the things we used it for was to deal with the Broad Rock School. We looked at the Broad Rock School, we saw what the cost was, we assumed a target number of around $4 million. We're almost at the $4 million, and I'll give you some details on that as we go forward. But we're almost at that amount. I think that if we continue to go forward and say to new population coming in that they're to pay for expanded school needs, that it's not appropriate. And if we're within $70,000 to $75,000 of what that target was, and again, it was a target, not a specific dollar amount, I think we've taken as much as we should be taking out of impact fees for education purposes, if the true necessity for those impact fees was because the students moving into new housing needed to be put into school buildings. Impact fees go back further than 2000. We were collecting them back in the 90s as well. But that was also at a time when we were putting additions onto each of the elementary schools twice, as well as the construction of the Broad Rock School. The Broad Rock School provided us with the focus to say, if that building is going to cost us $10 million to put into place, or whatever the cost was, I've got the detail here, and if we're going to collect $4 million, because half of the kids that are going to be in there are kids that are going to come from new houses that were built after 2000, I think we've gotten to a point where we have little justification to continue that program. So my recommendation would be to suspend education impact fees effective as of July 1 with the adoption of the capital improvement program by the town. The next item I wanted to talk about is on the real estate conveyance tax. Since 2014, we've collected $4.60 per thousand for real estate and tangible sales. We get, as a municipality, 47.83% of that money. What's that work out to? It's $2.20. So for every $1,000 in property sales that occur, we get $2.20. The council, going back many years, said when new real estate conveyance taxes were made available to the town, I think it was 2003, that the town would not take any more into the general fund, but would stockpile the new dollars that were going to come in and use those for open space acquisition as a part of growth management. So 77.3% of all of that $2.20 goes into, at this point, the real estate conveyance tax goes into the open space reserve. Its fund balance as of June 30, 2016 was $731,000. We anticipate collecting $300,000 in fees during the 16-17 year. As of December 31, we've collected about $155,000, so we're right on target to meet the 360, or to exceed the $300,000 that we expect. And the council's committed dollars to Whaley and to Wells Farms. Minimum cost there is $344,000. Maximum cost would be about $390,000. We're using the minimum cost as well as using $225,000 that we've annually used to pay down debt on land acquisition, particularly land such as the Noyds Farm. What we're looking at is that we'll have a balance as of June 30th, 2017 of around $462,000. We have been successful in the grant that we've written to be able to put the bike path in to the commons. We're expecting that project to be around a $600,000 program. That's a working number. We're assuming $200,000 will be a local cost. We can have that local cost come from a transfer from the open space fund into a capital reserve, which we'll set up for that bike path construction. That way we can get that entire project completed using the bond money that came from the green bond that was approved in November of 2016. What I'm also recommending is that $100,000 be set aside and placed into the Affordable Housing Reserve Fund. I've mentioned to the council, my concern is that several years ago we put $10,000 into the Affordable Housing Reserve Fund, and that was back in 2008. None of that money's been used at this point because it's too little to be able to be used for a proper planning study. Many people talk about affordable housing, but we have not yet defined what does affordable housing for South Kingstown mean. Is it single-family construction? Is it condominium? Is it apartments? Is it scattered site rehab of existing units? Is it working closer with the housing authority with subsidized, for their subsidized Section 8 units? Everybody's got a different opinion on what affordable housing means. What we really should be doing is saying to the Affordable Housing Committee, we're going to make the commitment of $100,000 with the Planning Department, with the Planning Board, and the Affordable Housing Committee, and whoever else needs input. Let's come up with a scope and develop a consulting contract to take a look at what are the needs in South Kingstown, how can those needs be addressed, and is it a way that that $100,000 can be leveraged with state dollars to be able to provide meaningful projects within our community? Are you going to need more money in other years? The answer is yes, but as long as the council identifies in goals and objectives that affordable housing is a meaningful goal, to implement that, we need to be able to do more than simply say that the Planning Department and Planning Board should be interested in that type of a program. So those are recommendations that I would hope council would give consideration to. The next page just simply shows the protected area. Let's see, where are we now? I finally get to tab 3. This section looks at what the bonded indebtedness of the town is, what the long-term financial plan is for capital projects, what the debt service, and let me make sure people understand what I'm talking about. When I look at debt, I look at how much money do we owe, what's the mortgage that the town has, what's the face value on it. When I look at debt service, I look at what are those monthly mortgage payments that we're making to be able to pay down that debt, and what's the interest that we're paying to assist in paying down that debt. And then the last item is the fair share development fees that we'll spend a couple of hours possibly on. So let's get started. We need to look back before we look forward. So if we look back, we look at the prior year, where were we? In the 2010-2011 year, we had a mortgage for the town of $26.35 million. We owed $26.35 million. Since that time, we've paid that down through the 15-16 year. Obviously, there's been no additional debt that's been incurred, but we've paid that down to a $12 million level. So essentially, over that period of time, we've paid off 54% of the town's outstanding debt. Now, when we talk with people from Moody's and we look at financial markets, they're interested in seeing over a 10-year period about a 40 to 50% reduction. So we're looking here at a much accelerated period of time where we're able to do that. But this was done based on the capital planning that was done between 11 and 16. There was a concerted effort made not to do additional borrowing at that point so that we could get a good deal of the debt off the table, so that as we took in additional debt, the debt service would replace and it wouldn't become a larger portion of the general fund's tax effort requirements. So, okay, so now we've gone from the 26 million down to 12. Now we look at 16-17. 16-17 jumps. You can see that we were at the 12 million last year. What we're saying is as of June 30th of 2017, that's going to start going up. That's going up to 15.3 million. Why is that? That's because you're borrowing $4.15 million for the rec center, and you're borrowing $1 million for the school department. Now, one of the things Trish is looking at is whether that $1 million should be $2 million, depending on where the project flows are. And again, this is why I say this is the planning document. At the time that we began the planning here, we looked at just a straight million. And again, $1 million in bonding means a debt service payment of $50,000 in principal, 20 years, equal principal payments. First year at 4% would be $40,000. Obviously, first year at 3% would be a $30,000 number. So again, it's flexible, and we're going to have to adjust based on what the real numbers are rather than what forecast numbers are. But if we do nothing else, if we said, we think what we did in the prior 5 years is the most important thing we can do in the next 5 years, is we got the rec center, we got $1 million for the schools, we're not borrowing anything else. Then it would mean you'd be down to a $5.9 million indebtedness as of that point. You'd be paying off 54% of your debt. You'd be down 14, you'd be down that type of an increase. Well, if you have important projects that need to be done, then you should integrate those projects. The next sheet talks about what are the projects that are slated in this year's proposed capital improvement program that will be incorporated with bond purposes. $400,000 with road programming, the $1 million, which is non-tax associated for the Guild, and $2 million for the school department, and those would be sold in the 18-19 year. Then we'd be looking at another $2 million being sold in the 2021 year. Remember, when we borrow in 2021, the debt service payments don't occur until the following year. All of our debt, exclusive of the debt associated with the rec center, is forecast to be let with equal principal payments for 20 years. Based on the size of the rec center at the 4.1, what I've suggested be done is to have the debt principal payments for the first 3 years less than what equal principal payments would be. Then in the 4th year, go to equal principal payments for the next 17 years. The reason I want to do that is one of the large bonds for the schools drops off in that 3rd year, so that we can then increase the debt service associated with the rec center, and I'll show you that as we go forward, without having a profound impact on the number of tax dollars that are necessary 1 year to the next. So if we added that $5.4 million into that existing schedule, that was the last page, what would happen to the debt level? The debt level still is at the $15.3 million for the 16-17 year. You'd add $3.4 million in FY19. That's why you see the bump up. And you see the purple is that we would be picking up is I think it was the 400,000. The purple is the guild that we're picking up. Then we would pick up another $2 million in 21. So then after 21, you'd see we'd start to decline again, because if you're making equal principal payments, you're accelerating. You're on a 10-year basis to repay 50% of your bond. With the rec center, again, you're going to have the first 3 years at a lesser amount of principal, but then you're increasing the principal for those next 7 years. So it's still going to be a little bit less than 50, but it will accommodate our needs as far as trying to lessen property tax impact. This next sheet is on 3-5. Now 3-5 looks at what the existing debt is for the 16-17 year. Now I've highlighted in yellow the bonds that would be sold. You can see under the town bonds the $4,150,000. So we would incur that debt in probably March of this year, and the $1 million with the schools. You can see that jumps up for the schools. We'll see that in one of the next slides. So as you can see here, in 17, you've got $4,150,000 that you owe. You're only dropping that $40,000 in 18. You're dropping it another $40,000 in 19. And then you start to drop it down 40,000 in 20. Then it starts going to a fuller amount. So you're going to pick up a change that's going to be there as far as what your principal amounts are going to be. So this is what we're trying to accomplish in terms of looking at what's going to be there as of June 30th, 2017. Next sheet on 3-6 looks at the borrowing, the $1 million in 19 for the guild and so forth, and the extra $2 million for the schools in 21. And you can see, what does that do? That brings us again down to the 10.5 million as of the 23rd year. Again, if the schools really need the $7.9 million, probably in 23 or probably in 23 we would see a bond sale that would be a necessity to go forward. Debt service on that wouldn't be within this study period, but the debt service would occur in 23-24 year. But I do want to make reference to that fact, because if that 7.9 is necessary, they don't have the bonding available to do that at this point. It would require either in the year 2000 general election or in 2022 year that additional bond issue would have to be considered. And again, until we see what needs to be done with that, we have to determine how do we reframe or repackage that 7.9 that's there today when we look at it next year, or we look at it the following year. Again, I don't want anybody to look at these numbers as being hard and fast, but rather how the numbers flow and what all of the different elements are that change the ebb and flow. Page 3-7 looks at the municipal debt level. And again, we're dealing only with the principal, not with the payments that we're making. So you can see that this shows that our, as of 16-17, we've got gross debt per capita, which is just taking the population and dividing it into the 13.5 million, $496 gross. When we take third-party revenues into consideration, for every person, we've got a debt of around $439. Some communities are significantly higher than that. You can see that 496 drops down to about 333, even though you're bonding that $5.2 million in new monies over the 19 and 20 year. The next page says, okay, you want to spend all that money, where's the money coming from? So we look at it, and you got 31% of the money that'll be coming from future capital budgets and so forth. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This will just show you what the pots are when you look at the next page. On page 3-9, we look at, well, where's the money coming from to pay for everything? When we look at the guild, the whole $1 million is coming from bond money. When we look at the Old Mountain Fields, one of the things we've recommended the council put into capital budget is the development of a reconstruction of the restrooms and concessions. That's a $400,000 item that we don't have financing available for. So we're showing that as an undefined funding source, yet we're showing it as a capital project to determine need. Obviously, the Rec Commission is recommending it. The question is this a project that we want to carry? We can carry it with an undefined funding. What we're also not doing is giving it a year as to when it would be completed. This is a project similar to what the Rec Center started out, where it floated for a number of years before it came to the drawing board and actually got put into a funding mode. Secured funds are dollars that are available with grants.
As far as the Old Mountain Field bathrooms, I know we're going to get into it tomorrow night when people come in and talk about the budgets, but I was surprised to see that was so far out, because I have heard it talked about for a long time. And with the kind of renewed interest in the area with the Waves games, and now we're going to have that bike path connection done up the road, I hope that we can have more discussions about how to make that a bigger priority for us.
And that's what I want the council to do, is to look at those priorities and say, because if you're interested in it, we can move it up. The question is, where do we fund it from? Or what falls off the table and gets delayed as a means of being able to put that one forward. But I agree with you. I think that the development of that type of a facility, similar, it's really, we're not looking for anything different, I don't think, and I'll let Terry talk more about it tomorrow night. Anything different than what we built at the Broad Rock Fields. Conventional restrooms as well as a small section for a concession. But the cost of that, when you're dealing with government contracting, and everything's got to be Davis-Bacon and prevailing wage, it's not going to be cheap. So we'll put that forward, and certainly we can discuss that. I would hope that there's a lot of the projects that the council will want to look at and say which ones are of most importance, and are there changes. Again, the only thing I can try to do for you is to tell you what I think can work. You've got to tell me if you want it reworked, how you want it reworked, and then I'll figure out how we can finance it. Other projects that are here, secured funds, as I talked about, South County Commons Bike Path, we're showing secured funds of $400,000, which would be the grant funds, where I'm also showing the $200,000, which would be open space fees that are there. So this chart is an important chart to say, well, if you're going to spend all this money, where's the money coming from? A lot of it's from future capital. Remember where I said that there was $7.8 million in pay-as-you-go or $9.8 million in pay-as-you-go that are coming into capital reserve funds. Those are the dollars you're seeing there with future CIP income. You got the municipal bonds, and then you got funds that are transferred from the operations. This is where at the end of the year, if the Public Works Department hasn't had a bad winter, we may have $100,000 that can be transferred. If it's transferred in, then we can increase the schedule of road improvements that we can make. Same thing if we have monies available within police or EMS, if we can transfer those dollars out so that the capital needs. Every time we buy a $200,000 EMS vehicle, we've got to budget it through capital programs. If we can transfer operating supports over based on efficiencies that were created in that department, then it's less money that'll have to impact future capital programs. So that's what we're trying to do here. So you've got the leisure service programs here. The next page shows you the general municipal program. Same type of situation. Bonds for public services is the only thing that's there. Secured funds, many of those are monies that are held in capital reserve funds, income that's coming in. You know, we put budget in the pay-as-you-go for public works as, for instance, $360,000 a year that gets transferred into that capital reserve. So over a 6-year period, we're looking at all of those types of dollars coming in, that $4.1 million. In addition to that, we're looking for $80,000 to $100,000 in op money under expenditures to be able to transfer in. Now you say, well, why don't you just reduce the size of the op budget? You can, but understand that as soon as we reduce the size of the op budget, we don't have the flexibility if we have major storms. And more importantly, if we do, and we have major storms, we get over expenditures. If we don't have the over expenditures, then we have to increase the capital budget because those $590,000 wouldn't be available. So again, the only thing I'm trying to instill upon you is that everything moves. No one number is independent of the other as to its impact on what project costs are going to be. The affordable housing, you see there, second line from the bottom, that's coming with the recommendation out of the OS funds. Last page just looks at the $7.9 million for the schools and the $1 million that would be out of secured funds for the meter replacement. Next page looks at the authorized bonds that were in the current year to next year. And again, it's because of the reductions on the bond sales that will occur. And that bonds in the next 6 years will represent about 26% of capital spending, where based on really the size of the gorilla in the room with the rec center, about 40% in the current year's adopted program. The other thing I wanted to point out is the bonds that are being sold as general obligation bonds that we do not expect to use general obligation funds to pay for the property taxes. That would be the Guild, as I've mentioned before. It would also be on the school bonds at 35% that would be reimbursed from the state. But again, I want to emphasize that it would be only those bonds that are approved by the state as being eligible for reimbursement. And since the moratorium has come off the state housing program, there have been huge dollar amount requests made to the state. So I think that there's going to be a greater stringency as to how that money is distributed. And one of the key questions that's being asked now that hadn't been asked in the past is, are the facilities necessary that you're asking to renovate? So I think the staffing and planning study that I've suggested should be incorporated into long-term planning for the schools is something that will be helpful when they finally get to doing the needs assessment that is going to be reviewed and approved by the state. Next item is the third-party revenues. In addition, when we float bonds, we also have funding sources. I've talked about the state housing aid, which is the 35% reimbursable. I'm not going to spend any time on that. I will note that when you look at the capital projects that the schools have put forward, the only projects that have state approval at this point are those projects shown through the 1920 year. Anything in the 2021, 21, 22, and 22, 23 years are forecasted projects that have not gone through the state review process. So, again, the first 3 years with the bonding that we have in place for the $4 million, that makes sense as far as being able to get the 35% reimbursements on that. What happens subsequent in the last 3 years will become more focused each year as we get closer to it.
Steve, I have a question. If we, just so I understand with the 35% reimbursement, if, say, we were to spend the money to renovate the parking lots that are budgeted for in here with the school department, and then say what we decided to just vacate one of those schools at some point, would we have to pay it back, the 35% that we were reimbursed, or how long is the time frame between when we could vacate that building and not have to pay it back?
As I noted in the budget message, the problem isn't so much that you paid back, it's that anything that's still yet to be paid off would not be eligible for the 35%.
Okay. Oh, okay.
An example was what happened with South Road. South Road had bonds outstanding at the time that it was closed as a school building. At that point, the state stopped providing that. At that point, it was a 30% reimbursement. Stopped providing that reimbursement. I believe, did we get the reimbursement back now that that building's back in operation?
No.
We still don't have it, even though the school department's using that. We've suggested to them that they request reimbursement on still the outstanding bonds that were there for the roof project that were there. But once that building was not used for a school purpose, the state cut off the 30%. That's one of the issues that I bring forward to you, is that I don't want to forecast bond repayment at 35% if, in fact, we lose it. Now, people say, well, if you make the improvement, you still get an improved building. I've got an improved building, but I was assuming 35% of that principal and interest, not just principal and interest, was coming through a third-party revenue source. And the revenue sources are important because every dollar we can get from other than property taxes to service debt saves us $1 in property tax effort. Neighborhood Guild, I don't need to go over that anymore. That would be paid for. If that project were let, we'd look at reinvested income. Right now, the reinvested income is about $315,000. But I'm assuming, I think it's $175,000 that we're carrying for the wheelchair ramp lift that is necessary for that building at this point. So if that gets us down where we're down in the $120,000, $130,000 range, unless we start seeing investment incomes well above the $380,000, then we're going to have to look at whether or not we want to assume that as a municipal project subject to municipal funding. So again, we're a couple of years away from that project, and we're going to have to do a better analysis on, is it 50% of that bond can be covered with reinvested income? Is it a case that we should only put 50% of the million out there in the market? And if you do, is it a case that you end up spending $1.2 million over the course of 10 years to put $1 million worth of work in because you don't have to remobilize? All of these things will come into discussion.
Steve, looking at the guild, the trust fund says the market value for the funds held in the trust for the guild were at about $14 million. So is that money that's accessible to us that we can use for these projects?
That's principal. That's money that's not spent. We generate, is it $380,000? About $380,000 a year from those trust funds. They're managed through the trustees of the school funds. So that $380,000 goes to offset about 45% of the cost of operating the guild. Guild budget's around $780,000, $800,000 budget, but the operational cost associated with the guild, what we've always attempted to do is to have the heat, electric, depreciation, just so that the programs can exist within a shell using the reinvested income. So in years past, there was far greater reinvested income. There was far more money coming in on that $14 million than we needed for operation of the Guild. So any excess went into the reinvested income account. That reinvested income account has been used to do capital items for the Guild over the years. Right now, we just finished doing the new staircase that's there. That work came out of those funds. We're also talking about the $175 necessary for the accessibility lift that needs to be put in. So we've used a good deal of the resources that are available. And obviously, over the last 5 years, investment income from any source has dwindled. So we've gone through several tight years where we're going to have to really do a serious look as to can that project go forward with what has always been the assumption that the reinvested income would be able to support it. I don't think we were ever looking at spending $400,000 in reinvested income accounts for major capital needs on the facade of that building. But we need to be able to get people that have limited mobility in and out of our programs. So we've got to spend that money.
When we were given the Guild, and under the condition that it always has to be available to the community or used as a Guild, is that correct? And if we ever stopped using it, then we'd have to give it back? Is that one of those properties?
No, I don't think that one, no, I don't believe so. I think that was just transferred to the town.
Oh, okay, so there's no, like, we're not at risk of losing.
No, it's not going back to the hazards, no. Okay. I mean, there's several deed of gift and deed of trust. I'd have to look at it to know specifically what that one looked like, but I don't think that there's any thought that would be going back to its providers. Other items that are there: real estate conveyance taxes. Again, we're not talking about decimating that open space program. What we're saying is that when we get 31% of the town in open space, it may be a time to be able to look at other needs that could be served outside of the general fund, such as the affordable housing initiative or dealing with special capital projects that we need a local share. Superfund projects, for those that aren't aware, we have two different bonds that were issued for Superfunds. $900,000 that was put out in 2005, and another $2 million that was put out in 2002 for closeout of those landfills. So we're still paying the bonds on that. Fortunately, we take in a good deal of revenue from the transfer station based on leasing that space out that has been able to be used to pay down debt associated with those bonds. So that to date, there haven't been tax dollars that have been used. The $2 million bond, I think, goes out to 2022, and the other one out to about 2026. But at this point, we still have sufficient revenues to be able to continue to service the debt using non-property tax sources. All right, so then that gets us to what's the impact of this program? If everything worked exactly like what we're talking about, what would occur? What would occur as far as the average taxpayer? Right now, the average taxpayer is paying about 23 cents of the $15.09 toward debt service costs. So that's around $79 of their approximately $5,300 bill goes toward debt. We're assuming that by the year 22-23, that number, if you just look at a 1% growth in taxable property and a 2% growth in levy, which is an artificial presentation of need, we'd be up to a 25 cent or $92 up from or about $12.98. I think that that's a false number. I think it's a mathematical calculation. It's a false number because I don't believe the 4% interest rate is what we're going to see. What are we seeing for market at this point? 2.93%. So with that 5.4 that we're going out, and we still have a couple of bonds that within the next 6 years we may do refis on, I think that we will have some of that debt service down in cost. So I think that these numbers work based on the math that we put into the charts, but whether it's a reasonable expectation is yet to be seen. Moving on, just some of the charts. On page 3-13, we show you the it was 3-13, changed. It's on, 3-13. We're looking at, when we look at this analysis, we look at Moody's. Moody's looks at different communities and says, well, what's the net direct debt that communities would have that were AAA? We're a AA community. They're saying it shouldn't exceed 0.63. They're saying that that for a AA community, it shouldn't exceed 0.98. So we're well below that even in the first year, and we will be as we go forward, even though we'll be adding that additional bonding over that period of time. The next chart on 3-15 shows the per capita, where we're looking at around $496 going down to about $333, and with the net cost being below that. So we're well below what the going rates would be. It's interesting that the General Treasurer, the last time they did an analysis, they looked at the liability statewide average at around $1,578, and we were in on that study at around $476. So we are still a leader as far as our debt ratios are concerned, and I think it's something that we should be proud of, because we're not going to just simply put out money for bond purposes and say, yeah, we can afford it and we can get up to 10%, because for every dollar that we put into debt service, we have less available for the operations programs. The next chart that shows on 316 looks at the debt per capita as a percentage of per capita income. This is another one that we do, but I don't give a lot of weight to it. In 2014, the Treasurer's Office indicated that long-term debt in Rhode Island, the average was 5.86%. We're in at 1.4%. So we're well below that standard. When he did the analysis, we were at 1.62, obviously before we paid down some of the debt, because he was looking at that in 2014 with a 2013 study period. One of the other things that we look at is the market value of the property divided by the population. So if you look, we've got a tax base of around $4.6 billion. We have population of 30,000, so our average value is about $151,000 per person in the community. From a Moody's perspective, AA, they're looking at about $110,000 being needed, and with a AAA around 227. So we're below the 227. But when you go back to years past before the recession, we were at AAA levels. But we're going to continue, I think, to see growth within the taxable roll, but I think it's going to be a much more moderate rate of growth. We're not seeing the appreciation on residential structures to the level that they were in the 2000 through 2007 timeframes. The next chart is looking at debt service as a percentage of operating revenues, and that's on page 317. And this is one, again, Standard & Poor's has used in the past a measure of 10%, and certainly we're well behind that. I think 10% is an outrageously high amount. If 10 cents of every dollar is going toward debt, that means that there's going to be a much more difficult means of running your programs at a proper level. I would never recommend that you would incur that type of debt, or if you were, that before you'd incurred that type of debt, you would really have to pay down existing debt to a very, very low level. I mean, we're seeing some communities with, you know, $40, $50 million that in debt obligations with smaller tax bases than we have. I think that's dangerous because it then means, where are you coming up with the money for the OPEB? Where are you coming up for your pensions? Those types of things. All of those things have to be part of the thinking when you start looking at long-term program. You don't want this to become 10% of your budget. Debt service as a percentage of the tax levy on page 314. The reason I'm jumping here is that I tried to keep all the debt in one place and the debt service in another. This one, as far as the analysis was concerned, you've got to look at it on page 314. We're looking at somewhere in the area of less than 3% as a percentage of the tax going forward for the debt service. So we're not looking at the mortgage anymore. We're looking at the mortgage payments. So we're saying 2.8% of every dollar that we collect for taxes is going to go for town and school debt. That reminds me of something else I want to make sure council's aware of. We set up with the council's approval, a municipal debt fund. And why did we do that? We did that so we're separating those bonds that are school and municipal in nature and separating those from the different enterprise funds and special revenue funds. So if we incurred bonds on behalf of the rec center, those bonds are going to be part of, they'll be part of the debt service fund because they're municipal in nature. But when we look at the enterprise funds or the guild, those aren't going to be part of the town's debt program. Those will stay in those programs. The reason we set up that fund is that we wanted another tool to be able to minimize the impact of new debt service, where we can have more money go in a given year than is required to pay the debt, have those excess dollars sit in that fund for that year to be available when there would be a spike because of a new debt being sold. And I'm going to show you that in the next couple of slides. First, just to talk about fund balance. We're maintaining the fund balance with the general fund at around the 13.2% rate. We're assuming that we'll even see some appreciation in the 16-17 year. Current year, 6 months that we've gone through, we're forecasting that at this point an $800,000 placeholder for a surplus. Certainly many things can change within the next 6 months, but as a placeholder we'd be in at 13.2. If that surplus were larger, obviously the 13 would take us up. The policy that the town has at this point is to look to have a target of 16.67%, or 2 years, 2 months of a 12-month period of available funds. You look at what's the overall budget, school and municipal, school transfer into the general fund, take 16.5% of it. If we had to go at that 16% rate, we would need about $12.8 million. We think that we're comfortable in the 13%, 10%, 12% range, where we're able to use fund balance to be able to accelerate programs to be completed. As you can see, when we had the rec center and the cost of it started to increase, we had another $200,000 that went from fund balance last year. We have used $600,000 that's been forwarded to the year. Over the last 5 years, we've taken that down from $1.2 million that goes into the budget from fund balance down to this year $600,000. In the 17-18 year, we've got to look at that on whether we can get that even a little bit lower. If we do, then it's going to make that balance a little bit stronger. But at this point, we're in very good position here. when we look with the bonding agencies, they're comfortable with where we are with the unassigned balance, because this is the unassigned balance for the general fund. We also have unassigned balance with all of our capital reserve funds, as well as reserve values within our special revenue funds, whether it's the senior services, the guild, those types of funds. So when you add those on top of what we have here, we have a good deal of financial structure that shows an ability to pay even if there were problems that occurred that were unanticipated. Bond rating, one of the things we had asked our financial consultants on is to look at what the medians are with South Kingstown as a AA1 to what other AA1s are in Rhode Island, as well as the New England or the U.S. And you can see that that our general fund size is a lot larger. What we're seeing is that the AA1s are smaller communities to a great extent, the Barringtons, East Greenwich, Middletown, maybe missing a couple there. But they're smaller sizes as far as their general fund and the general fund balance. We're at about 15.9 because this 15.9 isn't just the undesignated fund balance, but the total fund balance. We're a little bit low compared to those other communities. When we look at things like full value, you can see we've got a strong full value at 4.3 billion, as opposed to those other smaller communities at 2.6. And on a national level, we're in direct competition with what we see across the 50 states. When we look at the net outstanding debt, we are substantially less than what New England is and substantially less than what the U.S. is, but on par with what other Rhode Island communities would be. And you can see that our payout rate over the 10-year period for the GO bonds is considerably higher, but that's something that we have as a practice instituted over the past several years. I think South Kingstown spends a great deal more time on capital programming than many communities do, but I also think that the results of having the council make informed decisions gives us a step up in terms of dealing with the rating agencies. And make no mistake about it, the rating agencies are important. Right now, as a AA1, our bonds are of a higher value than what the state of Rhode Island is selling for. Debt service schedules. I'm going to try to go through this quick. If we go on to, we're dealing with the required debt, future debt, and then all debt. So let's start with the first chart on the required debt. This is just like the chart I showed you on debt programming, where we look at it and say, what would the debt service be going forward if in fact we didn't float that $5.2 million in additional bonds over the next 6 years. And you'd see we'd be dropping from the 23 cents down to 18 cents per thousand. Not a big difference between the 18 and the 25 cents based on the same mathematical assumptions that are being used. Jumping onto the next page, the all future debt shows you what the values would be with the debt loading that would occur. Talked about this several times, so I think you understand what we're talking about at this point. That gets us to the page 3-23. 3-23 looks at all of the debt that the town has, regardless of whether it's school debt or town debt. It looks at the utility debt, and it also looks at the guild debt. So when we look at this, we say, all of that debt, what are we paying in debt service? So in the 16-17 year, we're looking at, we have a gross debt of $2.1 million in debt service payments, and that's going to be at $1.8 million in the 22-23 year. But we've got the third-party revenues that we've got to take into consideration. So the third-party revenues that have to be taken into consideration are going to develop $1.1 million in the first year. So our real cost was $988,000 that was necessary for the 16-17 year. based on the new bonding that's going to be in place, we need $1,325,000. In the 16-17 year, we budgeted $1,250,000. So what we're really picking up is $125,000 in new cost. Was it 120? 1 point. Whatever it is, the increase for next year is $125,000. It was 1.2 million. 1.2 million for municipal and school debt will now be 1.325 in 17-18. I want you to look at the line that says planned debt service fund balance transfer. This is where we're going to take $106,000 in the 17-18 year that's in the fund balance from the debt service fund that will be used to pay debt service in 17-18, so that we don't have the spike. If we didn't, instead of $1,325,000, we'd be paying $106,000 more. In the following year, 18-19, we're going to still have $1,350,000, but we're going to be putting in $43,000 more than what we actually need, so that we can use that 2 years later when we put the other $2 million in. So you can see what we're doing is we're trying to keep your debt service for municipal and school purposes at the 1.3, 1.35, 1.375, and then taper it off. That way, if there is additional bonding, either municipal or school interest, that isn't on the horizon now, that comes to be in 22-23, you're down to $1,150,000. You've got flexibility for another $2 million. So this is what we're attempting to do. You can see there's some years that there's value added, some years where you're taking from the debt service fund. But that's a value to you that if you keep the debt service in your general fund and you have to fund every dollar each year, you are going to end up with spikes. And using this as a tool will keep you from having those spikes in place. That completes the debt program. The last item that we needed to talk about this evening is the fair share development fees. And I think I've already gone over that. First, we identify what education facility fees are for. They provide partial reimbursements on capital costs associated with new school facilities. Again, the key here is it can't be used for operational cost. It can only be used for brick and mortar expansion on facilities that are necessary because of incoming population. And again, as of July 1st of 17, I think we should terminate that program and assume that we're targeted around $4 million. On the open space program, again, what we're looking at is that we're collecting recreation impact fees that can be used either with land acquisition for new facilities or to be able to service new populations. So we're looking to use those dollars to be able to service the debt, particularly the debt that was incurred on the acquisition of Green Hill Park, which was the last major park that the land was acquired and the park was developed. We're using money from the recreation impact fees to be able to pay for those purposes. On the page 3-24, you'll see that an explanation on how we arrived at the cost associated with the construction of the Broad Rock School. The land acquisition, the facility cost was around $10.9 million. With interest expenses associated with the $10 million in bonding that was incurred, we're looking at a total cost over the first 20 years of around $15.5 million. Less the 30% aid reimbursement from the state, we're looking at a net cost to the community to have put that facility in place. And that's also just the facility. It's not including the recreation fields, the tennis courts, and other improvements that were there. And when we set up the recreation fees and education fees, We took a 25% discount on what we thought was a reasonable cost that should have been incurred, because we felt that if there was a class action brought against the town, if we had to justify our actions with a 25% factor that we weren't looking to collect, and we were only looking to collect 75 cents of every dollar that we thought we were entitled to, that we would be able to prevail in court with no difficulties. So what we're looking at is, of that $10.8 million, around $4,068,000 was a target number. And that target number's changed over the years. At one time, we were looking for more money than that. But as the amount of enrollment erosion occurred, it became less and less a factor that kids living in houses built since the 2001 year were actually making up 50% of the population of the school, of the kids going to that school. We never did a specific analysis, but it's just intuitive that you would look at that and say, that's going to be difficult to continue to provide that justification. It becomes more difficult on a yearly basis. So far we've put $3.8 million in education fees into paying down debt service costs on that facility. At the end of this year, we're expecting to have about $190,000 that will be in the fund balance. We would use that over the next 2 years to continue to service the initial debt that was incurred for Broad Rock, and using that additional $190,000 that will be in the fund, we're looking at having about $3.99 million of the $4,006,000 that we were using in this analysis as a target. I believe that we should leave it at that at this point and stop the collection of the education. I'm not recommending, however, the same on the open space recreation fair share fees that are shown on 325. When we look at the changes there, I'm using the formula that's in the zoning and land use plan, where they look at getting the assessor's office to provide an estimated value per acre of land, and using that for every fair market value of 10,000 square feet per 1,000 persons is what you would need for recreational activity. That's something that needs to be also updated based on the comp plan changes that are going to be occurring. Education, the recreation standards need to be changed within that comp plan to better reflect what the market is for recreation purposes today, both on an outside basis and an inside basis. Those have changed over the years as far as the number of basketball courts, football fields, tennis courts that a community needs based on population. We also look at what the number of persons per household are, and we look at, on the 2 bedrooms or less or plus 55 housing, that we've been using a factor of 1.95 and 2.6. So we're taking a 75% of what the census is telling us is the average house. Now we're down to 2.4 in the 17-18 year calc, but Gene put the land value up another $10,000 after the reval. So what we're looking at is that the fee increase would be about $10 for single family, and it would be up about $6 to $6.50, $7 on the 2 bedroom or less, or 55 plus. I think it's still a very fair view, particularly in view of the fact that we have expanded recreational activities because we are attempting to accommodate a larger population over the last 10 years. If we're going to have impact fees to be collected, even if it's just for recreation, we also have to have an override available for affordable housing purposes, so that if an affordable housing unit is deemed and put into existence, they would not be required to pay the fair share fee. So what the state has looked at is said, well, let's look at 80% of adjusted median income for a four-person household, which works out to be $58.25 thousand. They look at what they project real estate taxes to be and what a mortgage rate at 3.41% for a 30-year mortgage, plus hazard insurance. And their analysis, they suggest that any unit that sells for under $209,975 would be exempt from the impact fee, provided that they also register the house or the property as an affordable unit for a limited period of 30 years. So we do incorporate an affordable exemption because we think it's only fair that we're not looking to place another $3,200 in value on really what ends up becoming part of their mortgage for an affordable housing unit, particularly if our objective is to promote affordable housing in the community. And with that, it's what I wanted to get completed for this evening. Are there questions that council has on any of the components that we've put out there?
Steve, I was wondering, I agree with Meg, this is really presented well, especially this binder. If anybody doesn't have this or, wants to look at it, come to the town hall, or you can download it online too. It's just really organized well. I was curious, our village studies and the recommendations that are made within them, are they, how do they impact your overall capital improvement planning? And do we see any examples of that in this particular document this year?
I think that the village studies are going to impact the comp plan more than they're going to impact the capital budget until the comp plan's updated. Right now, the comp plan has a life up through June 30th of 2017. We're looking at the update. The council had authorized the hiring of a consultant. In fact, the work is going to start in earnest this month. There's 2 sessions that are coming. There's certain parts of the comp plan that are going to be updated, and they're going to incorporate portions of the village studies. One of the things that I've said my concern is with the comp plan is that it is far too broad at this point as far as its implementation schedule. And what we're seeing is that we've got mom and apple pie rather than the reality of what we can actually accomplish. And that what I'm hopeful for is that the comp plan implementation schedules, which would incorporate recommendations that come from the village studies, provide meaningful identification of what can be accomplished rather than simply saying we're going to promote this type of an activity. Because if in a global sense, it may be something that everybody would say that's a great idea, but there needs to be practical in the planning as much as there needs to be planning in terms of high ideals. I think that we need to look at what the ideals are, but we also then need to have an implementation schedule that we can really accomplish. And I think sometimes it's easier to come up and to put everything in as being part of the implementation schedule, even though you'll never have the dollars to be able to accomplish it, or the resources of staff to be able to accomplish it. So again, I'm hopeful this year that as we look at the development or redevelopment of the comp plan, particularly in the areas of sustainability, energy management, the global warming issues, hazard mitigation, particularly natural hazard mitigation, all of these components need to be a party to that study, and then a practical implementation schedule developed. So I don't know if I've really answered your question other than to say I really have difficulty being able to have global ideas come into a practical reality if it's just simply going to say we think that pedestrian access to all streets is necessary. We need to understand what are we really saying. If if we're looking at that, you know. I've had people, you know, we had the discussion when we did Matunic Beach Road, and the discussion was, gee, we should have bike paths on Matunic Beach Road. We should have sidewalks on Matunic Beach Road. But the practical reality is that from an engineering perspective, we would have also had to look at how do we put 4-foot lanes on either side of Matunic Beach Road, provide for the drainage improvements that would be required under DEM regulations at this time, because it was more than it was becoming a reconstruction. And in those portions that now, instead of having two 12-foot lanes, we've got 24 plus another 8, 32. And if, in fact, we go one step further and say we should also have sidewalks, then we're out where we've got a 40-foot bituminous or concrete. These are impractical suggestions. And sometimes they're used against us to say that we're not being practical in terms of trying to deal with evidence that comes through at the village studies. But at the same time, we have to say to them, is there a realistic expectation that those things can be accomplished? You know, it goes back to South Road. South Road, people wanted sidewalks. When we did the sidewalk analysis and we told them that they were losing major trees and there would have to be stone walls constructed, the people ran away from the sidewalks and said we would rather have it the way it is. Now, would I like to see sidewalks on all of these streets or bike lanes on all of these streets? I would, but I also have to look at, is there a practical application that can happen? TMDLs are affecting us on any of the areas that we're going to do street drainage. You can see High Street is a classic illustration of what changes drainage is going to make. For us to be able to get the drainage improvements that are occurring on High Street is going to require us to do mitigation on town land using state money, where we're going to reconstruct drainage ways at the high school, at Hazard School, and at the town parking lots. Because we have to be able to accommodate the water that's now going to flow through the High Street system in other areas within the watershed. So my point is that it doesn't seem as if anything is simple anymore. And everything is interrelated. And if we're going to talk about specific projects, we need to look at what are the practical realities and also what the costs are going to be. So enough on my soapbox.
Just curious, what was the educational facilities impact fee that we were charging up until, or that we are currently charging?
I don't recall. Vin, do you remember the impact fee values? I think they were in the area of $2,800, if memory serves me correct. I think it was around $2,800 last year, because they had been as high, I think it's around $3,500 or $3,600, and we had reduced those accordingly. And I think it had got down to around $2,800 for the single-family unit. And, you know, during the major developments that were occurring in the 90s, we were seeing, you know, several hundred houses a year. And we're now looking at probably in the 50 to 60 range for full-size houses. And many of those are in the age-restricted units. But, I mean, in a lot of ways, you've run out of land. That would be, you know, from a practical standpoint.
I'll just echo the comments of the council here. As usual, the presentation is so thorough that you don't leave a lot to ask. Great job by you and your staff, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow night.
There may be questions from the floor. You can get them from the floor if you like. It's really council's prerogative.
Good evening, it's Kenny Burke. I just wanted to point out that the calculus that's in this budget is pretty thorough, and I concur with the council that it's tough to make substantive comments in such a very lengthy and thorough presentation. It occurred to me as I did a cursory review of the budget, specifically the capital budget, that I'm not sure where the town is going in terms of its investments. I like a lot of the initiatives in terms of the Sustainability Committee. I'm seeing a lot of funding that's going towards recreational facilities, an acknowledgement of the demographics where there's an aging population, an acknowledgement of increased housing costs and the need to do something, an acknowledgement of the village studies that have been put forth that I think have been acted upon in the past, but in this current capital budget, I don't see a tremendous amount of action. On an annual basis, we see the shell game in terms of the tax rate balancing out property values to accommodate that 80+% of our income needed to sustain the town budget, where residences fundamentally shoulder that burden. There is some opportunity for commercial and industrial to play an increasing role if you want to talk about sustainability for the town and what its future is going to be. And I'm interested to see how that plays into the detailed conversations in the capital budget tomorrow night, and then subsequently in the operating budget. Because right now, I just don't understand it. I just know anecdotally taxes go up, enrollment goes down, state aid goes down. We need to invest in our schools. We all love open space. But I don't see on in the out years how the town of South Kingstown even looks remotely like we remember it, like it is today. So again, kudos to the town manager for presenting yet another well articulated and balanced budget. But I'm just still left with a lot of questions. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Hi, Karina Burston, Wakefield. I just have it's actually a technical question, and I'm not really understanding on the 6-year projects where you have an adopted program budget and a proposed program budget, and then the defined funding sources. I'm just unclear why we're aiming for the proposed budget rather than the adopted budget.
The adopted budget is the budget for the 16-17 year. What we're proposing is a budget for the 17-18 year.